May 29th, 1943 RAF Alconbury, England. The overcast sky hung low and heavy, trembling with the distant thunder of engines. Captain James Hartwell, 26 years old, stood on the tarmac beside a machine that looked more monster than aircraft. Its name was YB-40, the heaviest B-17 ever built, a flying fortress reborn as something deadlier. Mechanics swarmed over it, feeding long belts of 50 caliber ammunition into 16 gun mounts that bristled from every angle. When Hartwell placed a gloved hand on the cold fuselage, he could feel the hum of history in the making. For months, the 8th Air Force had been bleeding men and bombers over Europe. The Reich's heart lay deep beyond fighter range, and every mission that crossed the Rhine was a gamble against the Luftwaffe's Fu-190 and Bf-109. They came in waves, screaming down from 12 o'clock high where the B-17's nose guns couldn't track fast enough. The losses were unbearable. 173 flying fortresses downed in just 3 months. Hartwell's YB-40 was meant to change all that. 4,000 pounds heavier than the standard B-17 Farads, it carried twice the ammunition load, twin top turrets, side-mounted twin guns, and a newly engineered chin turret, the first of its kind, aimed to sweep the deadliest approach vector. The crew called it the Porcupine. The brass preferred something grander, the Flying Destroyer. Inside the cockpit, Hartwell settled into his seat. Beside him, co-pilot Lieutenant Frank Donnelly cracked a grin. 16 guns, he said, checking the ammo counters. If Jerry wants a fight today, he'll get one. Hartwell just nodded. He'd flown 42 combat missions, but never in something this heavy. The YB-40 groaned, even as its engines throttled up. At 11:47 a.m., the squadron took off toward Kiel, a shipyard target buried deep in northern Germany. 48 bombers in formation, 2 YB-42s flying Guardian positions along the flanks. At first, the plan worked. Enemy interceptors darted in, and the Porcupine spat fire. Twin streams of tracers slashed across the sky, shredding the lead Fu-190 before it could roll away. Crews cheered over the radio, but then came the turn home. At bombing altitude, the regular B-17 seconds dropped their payloads nearly 6,000 pounds lighter. Hartwell's YB-40, still laden with guns and ammunition, suddenly lagged. The formation began to pull away. He pushed the throttles forward, but the airspeed barely nudged 160 knots. The gap widened. Alconbury Control, this is Fortress 8, 1, Hartwell radioed, voice tight. Unable to maintain formation speed. We're falling behind. Static. Then silence. By the time they crossed back into the North Sea, the sky was empty except for contrails vanishing into the horizon. The YB-40 flew alone. And that's when the Germans came back. Section 2. The last fortress in the sky. The sun had already begun to sink behind the clouds when they saw them black specks on the western horizon, diving fast. Hartwell's heart hammered as he leaned forward against the stick. Bandits! 5 o'clock high! The tail gunner, Sergeant Alan Pierce, shouted through the intercom. Looks like 6, maybe 8. The F-190 came in screaming, sunlight flashing off their wings. The first burst of cannon fire raked the YB-40's tail. Aluminum shards scattered through the cabin. Pierce returned fire immediately twin. 50 seconds hammering so hard the fuselage trembled. The gunners on the waist joined in, pouring lead into the oncoming fighters. Tracer lines stitched the air like burning threads. The Germans peeled away, then came again, circling like wolves around an injured beast. Hartwell kept his head low, gripping the controls with white-knuckled hands. Hold her steady, he barked, as the bombardier, Lieutenant Henry Walsh, swung the chin turret toward the next attacker. The new turret, one of Boeing's experimental additions, tracked fast and low. The twin Brownings barked, spitting fire directly into the path of a diving 190. The enemy exploded in a flash of black smoke and fire. The crew erupted in a cheer that lasted less than 3 seconds before another burst slammed into the port engine. "Number 2's hit. She's smoking bad," yelled Donnelly. Hartwell cursed under his breath. Feather it. Keep her level. The YB-40 had the firepower of a gunship, but the speed of a truck. Loaded down with nearly 4,000 pounds of extra weight, it couldn't outrun or outclimb anything. Even as the German fighters broke off one by one, the fortress flew crippled and alone. They limped across the North Sea, engines coughing, with flak holes large enough to stick a helmet through. When the wheels finally touched the runway at Alconbury, ground crews ran out to meet them. The fuselage was peppered with over 200 bullet holes. 2 guns were jammed from overheating. The crew stepped out, shaken but alive. "Guess we made it," Donnelly muttered. Hartwell looked back at the shredded tail and didn't answer. He already knew the truth. That night, under the dim lights of the debrief room, the pilots didn't celebrate. The mission log simply read, 1 aircraft lost. Objective achieved. Escort unable to maintain formation. In the following weeks, the YB-40 project continued 48 missions flown in all. Every sortie confirmed the same flaw. The moment the bombers lightened their load, the gunships lagged behind. Crews joked bitterly that the YB-42s needed their own escorts. By July 1943, the decision came down from U.S. Army Air Forces Command. Program terminated. The engineers at Boeing and Vega were ordered to halt production after just 12 units. Still, in the quiet hangars of England, technicians took notes. They measured, studied, and debated every inch of the failed aircraft. The chin turret, once an experiment, had proven invaluable. Waist gunners praised the staggered gun positions, which reduced blind spots and friendly fire. Even the new Cheyenne tail turret, with its wide field of view, was a leap forward. It was clear that the YB-40 had failed as a concept, but succeeded as an innovation lab. And in war, sometimes that was enough. Section 3. Lessons written in smoke and steel. July 1943, somewhere over the North Sea again. A formation of B-17Fs, leaner and faster, droned toward the English coast. Among them limped one of the last YB-42s still operational, its once proud fuselage patched with crude aluminum plates. The crew rode in silence. They knew this would be their final combat flight. Captain Hartwell stared through the canopy at the endless grey water below. "So this is it," he murmured. "Our last ride." From the radio compartment, Sergeant Pierce's voice crackled. "Maybe it's for the best, Skipper. She's too damn heavy to keep up." Hartwell smirked, just barely. "Yeah, maybe Boeing will find a way to make her fly again." But Boeing already had. Back in Seattle, engineers had been quietly dissecting the data sent from England turret efficiency reports, gunner feedback, weight distribution analyses. They weren't building another YB-40. They were building its successor, a new generation of B-17 seconds that would inherit its best ideas and shed its worst. The chin turret was the first to be standardized. Crews had begged for a way to counter frontal attacks, and now they had it a hydraulically powered, remote-controlled mount that gave the bombardier a 180-degree firing arc. Next came the staggered waist guns, offset to prevent gunners from bumping elbows or firing into each other's line of fire. Finally, the Cheyenne tail turret, with its improved traverse and visibility, offered a lethal rear guard. Together, these innovations gave birth to the B-17G, the definitive flying fortress. It would go on to fly more missions than any bomber in history. It would carry the 8th Air Force deep into enemy territory, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and back again. And it would help turn the tide of the air war over Europe. Yet the men who flew the YB-42s rarely spoke of their role in that evolution. Their aircraft were stripped, reassigned, or scrapped. Only one survived long enough to be photographed in its final state, parked behind a hangar, engines removed, its name barely legible on the nose. Tampa Tornado. To most, the YB-40 was a footnote, a failed experiment buried in the archives of the Air Force Materiel Command. But to those who understood the language of war, the constant push between necessity and invention, it was something more. Every rivet, every burned-out barrel, every mechanic's note scrawled in oil pencil had written a lesson in survival. The men who flew those 12 flying destroyers had proven that even failure, when dissected honestly, could save lives. By the winter of 1944, with thousands of B-17Gs flying the skies, bomber losses from frontal attacks dropped by 71%. That meant thousands of airmen's sons, fathers, and brothers came home alive. And though Hartwell's name never appeared in the headlines, he received a letter one spring morning, months after the YB-42s were gone. It was from Boeing. A single line stood out. "Your feedback on the forward turret has saved more men than you'll ever meet." No. He folded the letter and tucked it into his flight jacket pocket next to a small brass bullet he'd picked from his cockpit floor the day the Porcupine limped home. The YB-40 never became the hero it was meant to be, but in its wreckage lay the blueprints for victory. A magnificent failure and a priceless innovation. Section 4. A Fortress Remembered. Autumn, 1944, Framlingham Airfield, Suffolk. The morning fog hung thick over the English countryside, swallowing the silhouettes of bombers waiting on the tarmac. Beneath the rumble of engines and the clatter of ground crews, one aircraft stood out not because of its shine, but because of its scars. It was a B-17G, tail number 42 to 97834, freshly fitted with the same chin turret design that once turned heads on the YB-40. A young pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hawk Davidson, ran his hand along the cold steel casing. "They say this thing came from a failed project," he said, half to himself. "If that's true, I'll take failure any day." The crew around him chuckled, loading belts of ammunition into the forward guns. To them, this bomber wasn't just a machine, it was hope. Every turret, every staggered gun mount, every tiny engineering improvement meant one more chance to make it home. When the engines roared to life, the vibration echoed across the field, blending with the cough of exhaust and the faint strains of Glenn Miller from a nearby radio. The air smelled of oil, cold metal, and adrenaline, the scent of war's machinery. As the formation climbed toward the coast, Davidson's bomber led the group, its chin turret sweeping like a sentinel scanning the clouds. The German interceptors would come, as they always did, but this time, the Fortress would not fly blind into the Sunday. From their command post below, Major James Hartwell, older, now assigned as a tactical evaluator, watched the new B-17G take off. He'd been grounded for months, his days of flying over, yet seeing the sleek, balanced symmetry of the new design stirred something inside him. The chin turret he'd once manned, the tail guns he'd nearly died, defending all now reborn in steel and motion. He whispered, almost to himself, "You finally made it." The war had changed. Escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang now roamed the skies, extending Allied reach deep into the heart of Germany. But the lessons learned from the YB-40 remained embedded in every mission plan, every bomber formation. The Air Force no longer chased the dream of the indestructible gunship. Instead, it mastered the art of synergy. The escort and the bomber, each relying on the other, had become the backbone of Allied air superiority. By early 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled, the B-17G was flying with near-impossible efficiency. Missions that once cost dozens of planes now returned with all aircraft accounted for. Crews who once prayed for survival now dared to hope for victory. And somewhere in the ledger books of the Air Technical Service Command, the YB-40's file gathered dust stamped with a single line: "Project concluded. Design influence continued." Yet to those who knew the engineers, the pilots, the gunners who'd lived through the experiment, it was never really concluded. It lived on every time a bomber fought back and won. Every time a formation made it home through flak and fire. Years later, long after the war had ended, a journalist tracked down Hartwell at a small airshow in Ohio. His hair was grey, his uniform replaced by a worn leather jacket. Beside him sat a display model of the YB-40, its gun ports shining under the summer Sunday. "Do you ever think it was worth it?" the journalist asked. Hartwell smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Son, every man who came home because of that failure, that's the worth. You can't measure that in missions or medals." The camera clicked. Behind him, a B-17G thundered into the air, its engines still carrying the echo of the past, a sound born from trial, error, and courage. In the end, the YB-40 didn't just guard bombers, it guarded the future. Section 5. The Legacy of a Beautiful Failure. Spring, 1958 Dayton, Ohio. The wind swept gently over the runways of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel and nostalgia. Inside a quiet hangar, a single aging bomber sat on static display, its olive paint faded, its nose art long since erased. Few visitors paused to read the small bronze plaque beside it. Boeing YB-40 Flying Fortress Prototype Escort Gunship, 1943, one of 12 built. The concept failed, but its innovations saved thousands of lives. A boy, no older than 10, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why did it fail?" he asked, staring at the strange, bristling gun ports that peppered the fuselage. His father, a former navigator who'd flown B-17Gs over Berlin, smiled softly. "Because it tried to do everything by itself," he said. And in war, even fortresses can't stand alone. Outside, jet bombers like the B-47 Stratojet roared overhead symbols of a new age of speed and technology. Yet inside that hangar, surrounded by relics of aluminum and history, the YB-40 whispered a different kind of progress, one born not from victory, but from humility. The engineers who had once drawn its blueprints now worked in labs designing supersonic aircraft. They carried forward the same mindset forged in 1943: experiment, fail fast, and salvage what matters. Many of them would later shape the designs of the B-29 Superfortress, and eventually the B-52 Stratofortress, which would define American air power for decades. But the lineage traced back further to the gunship that couldn't keep up. In military archives, declassified memos revealed just how much the YB-40 had taught its makers. Notes scribbled in the margins of Boeing's internal reports read, "Forward gun angle effective retain in next model. X. Weight ratio unsustainable, find solution in lighter turret. Crew feedback vital, increase visibility for tail gunners." Each line was written by men who refused to let failure be final. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe veterans who had once hunted the YB-42s remembered those lumbering beasts differently. Hans Richter, a former FLAU 190 pilot, recalled in a post-war interview, "We couldn't believe how many guns it had. We called it the Hellenigel, the hedgehog from hell. But when one fell behind, we knew it was doomed." Still, it made us cautious. You didn't rush those. To the German pilots, it was both threat and curiosity, an airborne paradox that seemed too heavily armed to be real. Back in the United States, Hartwell lived quietly, teaching aviation engineering at Purdue University. He often began his lectures with a simple truth, learned the hard way. If it doesn't fail, you haven't pushed far enough. He never romanticized the YB-40, nor did he regret flying it. To him, it represented a single line of evolution in a much greater story, a reminder that progress is built upon the wreckage of what came before. In 1962, he received a letter from a student who'd gone on to work for Boeing's advanced design team. It read, "Sir, we're experimenting with forward-mounted sensors on the Stratofortress. Your lecture on the YB-40 gave me the courage to try something unconventional. If it works, we'll have you to thank." Hartwell folded the letter and smiled. History, he realized, doesn't always honor its pioneers, but it remembers their fingerprints. By the time he passed away in 1971, only fragments of the YB-40 remained: a turret in a museum, a logbook in a private collection, a few faded photographs of crews posing beside their flying hedgehog. Yet the DNA of that experiment lived on in every aircraft that carried its spirit from the B-17G to the modern gunships of Vietnam, like the AC-47 Spooky, and even to today's AC-130 Spectre. They were all, in a sense, descendants of that idea, the dream of a fortress that could protect others. So when we look back on the YB-40 today, it's not as a failure, but as proof that courage and curiosity are two sides of the same coin. Because in war, as in invention, The cost of progress is often paid by those willing to fly just a little too far ahead.